Okay, I'm very happy to be welcoming Fern Halper back to another episode of Speaking of Data. She is, of course, the Vice President and Senior Director of TDWI Research for Advanced Analytics. Thank you so much for coming back on the podcast, Fern.
Yeah, happy to be here. Happy to talk about this topic.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's get right into it. It looks like today we're going to be discussing organizing to execute for modern analytics. So what do you mean by organizing models, like for modern analytics? What does that mean?
Okay, so first of all, when I say modern analytics, I'm talking about newer kinds of analytics that are in use. That includes things like machine learning, AI, the generative AI that we've been hearing a lot about. And what we're seeing is that organizations are collecting new and diverse kinds of data. They're collecting high volumes of data, and they want to use that data for insights as well as, in some cases, monetization, right? So they want to sell it. They want to build applications that use it. So that's the notion of a data product or data as a product. So I'm going to build an application that makes use of data and analytics and then sell that application in a marketplace. So that's what I mean by modern analytics and models. But in terms of the organizational models, I'm talking about how organizations are organized to execute. And we basically see three models that include centralized, decentralized, and hub and spoke. So in the centralized model, it sounds like what it is. All of the data functions and ownership and activities, all of that resides sort of in a central office, if you will. And then that office is responsible for the data strategy, the data platform, for governance, policies, and standards. And then there's the decentralized model. And in that one, that's distributed. So it's a decentralized or distributed model. And there, the data activities are distributed into different business units. So in other words, the business unit owns their data as well as what they want to do with it. And so, you actually have the data and analytics functions sitting in the business units. And then there's the hub and spoke model. And, that's sort of a combination where there's an office that's a centralized office, potentially, that provides services to the units that are the spokes. So it provides strategies and policies and standards. They may be responsible for the architectural design of the data infrastructure and delivering an environment that can be used to support analytics like machine learning, like the modern analytics I was talking about. And so they also may be responsible for coordinating data governance and analytics governance activities. So in other words, the spokes, the units, they work with their own data, but they work closely with this data office to ensure that data is high quality and that it's available for use. And, that may be across the organization, especially if organizations are offering up data as a product. So the analytics might occur in the spokes, but the central office, the hub, may recommend the products that you should be using. So it's sort of a combination of the two.
Are you finding one of those models being more widely used than others?
Honestly, in some research, we see a hub and spoke model, being used and organizations being successful with it. But so far, I think the jury's out, in terms of which one is being used more. Although with large organizations, I think the distributed model, the decentralized model is used more, but unclear whether they'll migrate to, this hub and spoke type of model, if it makes sense for them or not.
Well, that's very interesting. I suppose the next question that I have for you is what's driving this? Like, what are the trends that are making it necessary for these new models?
Yeah, I think that there's a couple of trends. I think that modern analytics, including data products, itself is sort of driving the need for these new models, because there's new roles. First, in terms of what's driving it is this move to the cloud because of the new data types and the need to perform complex analytics. And then there's this whole move towards democratization. So for instance, data analysts who are building dashboards now, they're moving to more sophisticated analysis, building machine learning models for example, and then there are these new technologies, including automated approaches that are occurring across the data and analytics lifecycle. So the organizations are trying to build out new pipelines and new processes and put new technologies in place, so as part of that, they may be moving to new organizational models also to make sure that they're organized to execute. What we're seeing is, for example, that a chief data officer is becoming a more popular title, so chief data officer, chief analytics officer, chief data and analytics officer, it's sort of all the same thing in some ways. So moving to this modern analytics, organizations are realizing that they need someone to really head all of this up. That's, sort of bringing on this need for this chief data officer. The chief data officer may be in charge of the data office that I talked about, that may be centralized, or it may be part of this hub and spoke model, or, they may even be in the C-suite. The thing is, it's always an evolution, I think. Just when you think you see the goalpost in sight, then the goalpost moves because things change.
So I think you touched on some of the new roles there. Is there also a change in the way that teams are being structured as well?
Yeah, I mean, there are new roles. There's lots of new roles, and then also sometimes the teams are being structured. We see some of these new structures as like pod structures. Some organizations will have pods where they actually may combine a couple of different people. Some people call them tiger teams, or they could be pods, where maybe you have a data engineer together with a data scientist and maybe, some other person, that's responsible. If you're in a distributed model or a hub and spoke model where they need help, you're actually sort of going out and helping them. But there's lots of other roles, also that are evolving. I talked about the chief data officer and the chief data and analytics officer, whatever you want to call them. There's also these modern analysts, and they're sort of this next generation analyst. If you've heard the term citizen data scientist, sometimes they're the citizen data scientist. So they're someone that may have been a business analyst, they understand the business, and they're moving on to do more sophisticated analysis. They're trying to learn some data science techniques. There's obviously the data scientist, and that's not a new role. We've been talking about that role for like 10 years, but it's an up and coming role in some organizations that are just starting to develop advanced analytics. And so these data scientists have the technical skills to work with and analyze all kinds of data, from structured data, to text data, and then they're building models and so on. I talked a little bit, I think I said something about a data engineer, but that's a new role, newish role, that's often part of this data ops team that we're hearing more about, and that's this data ops process is the process where you're integrating data, you're transforming it, you're preparing it, and trying to get it ready for analysis. So these data ops people, these data engineers, may be actually trying to get this data ready. They're integrating it. In some cases, they may be getting it into shape for data scientists. They may be developing some of the features that go into machine learning models. They may not be, but they may be at least setting it up so that the data scientists, can figure out what type of attributes / features they want to put into their models. Other newer teams, that includes things like ML ops teams, machine learning operations teams. So once you develop a machine learning model, that's really only half the battle. You want to be able to put that model into production. And that often means that you need an ML ops team to help to do that, especially once you start getting a lot of models. So although the data scientists may build the model, the ML ops team is the one that's going to put it into production. They're going to ensure that the model actually works. If you're building an application, you want to make sure that the machine learning model works in the application on the platform that you're deploying it on. You want to make sure that the models are updated so that they don't get stale. You want to make sure that the models are treated like code, all of that, so these are often highly technical people. There's also we're seeing these literacy enablement teams. So because if you want to move forward with modern analytics, you really need to be, your organization needs to be data literate. So that means that the organization needs to understand the data. They need to be able to interpret results, derive insights from data, communicate results. And, the level that they do that is going to vary by role. But what we see is that data literacy and this literacy enablement team is often, part of all of this. And they're often part of the data office that I talked about, which may be part of this hub and spoke model. And additionally, the last new role I think I'd mention is the data product manager. So we're viewing data more as an asset and a product. So organizations are starting to fill this role of data product manager. I think we're going to hear a lot more about that this year. And that person is responsible for making sure that consumers are happy with the product, and they're responsible for developing new products with data. They're like a product manager, and developing these data products. And so some of these roles are already, in place, like the data scientist, the data engineer, even the CDO. I'd say like close to half the organizations we survey, they already have these roles in place, but then like the data product manager, the ML ops engineer, those are fewer in number because it's basically newer. Organizations aren't necessarily putting that many models into production. They're just starting to think about data as a product, that sort of thing. So these new roles are evolving as part of that.
Quick follow-up to that is, you mentioned the team structures being like pod or tiger teams. Is there a specific reason why companies would want to move to that sort of structure?
I think that they want to be nimble, and they want to be agile, and nimble, and it may be that the business units don't want to fund, they don't want to, they don't have the funding for those people for full time, but at certain points in time, they need these people to come in and actually help out. They're sort of like an internal consultant.
Sure. Okay, so then I guess in your estimation, is there one model that is better than another model for analytics?
Well, I do sort of like this hub and spoke approach in some ways, but I will say that it depends. We actually looked at this in one of our best practices reports. So what I did, I actually separated out. I asked people to sort of self-identify as to whether they were being successful or somewhat. So if they were being successful, were they being successful in actually measuring success with their analytics? Or are they being successful and not necessarily measuring any impact, or were they completely unsuccessful? So I looked at those three groups, and then I tried to do a statistical analysis to see if there was any one of those three organizational models, that was statistically, more likely, like were more successful organizations more likely to use a hub and spoke model, or more successful organizations more likely to use a centralized model. And honestly, I could not see, as I think I mentioned, there was no statistically significant difference, at least at this point in time. And I do think that there are pros and cons. And I looked across different company sizes and industries and all of that, and I still couldn't see anything yet. That doesn't mean that there isn't something to be seen. I just couldn't necessarily see it, but I think that there are pros and cons, of each approach. Like a centralized model might work well in a smaller organization that has a simple data infrastructure, or companies that are focused on a single business, so it makes sense to centralize everything. It might not work well with a large organization that has diverse lines of business, right? Because if they have different lines of business, maybe they don't need to share their data. Maybe it doesn't make sense, for it to be a centralized model. So in terms of the decentralized model, if you think about businesses owning their own data and analytics on the surface, that sounds like a good thing. But what I've seen happen is that it can frustrate the analysts who are actually working in the units, because the analysts want to collaborate across business units, and they want to learn and grow. And sometimes, they feel like they're just, tied into this one organization. And then, also it can, foster like a situation where there's data silos and there aren't data standards across the organization, and that can make the data unmanageable. And then there can also be duplication of efforts and, all of that. And so I think the hub and spoke model, it can be best for organizations that have varied lines of businesses and they have the resources and skills to perform data and analytics. So, the hub, I think, is providing these policies and standards, and they're coordinating governance, and they may be thinking about, an overall sort of data architecture that's going to provide some sort of unified environment for the organization. And so each business unit has flexibility to do their thing. But unlike the decentralized model, this model provides centralized support, and it has this hub and specialized skills in the hub, that may be where those tiger teams or pods, sort of come and help. So in one study that we did, the hub and spoke model did come out on top, but as I said, I think that the jury's still out on that. But I think organizations, some are evolving to that model, especially in terms of data governance, because they like the idea of a coordinated central area for data governance.
Yeah, I was going to ask how difficult it might be to have unified data governance in a decentralized model. It feels like it would be really difficult to oversee all of that. Is that the case?
Yeah, I mean, there could be, they could use their traditional sort of, data governance councils, and that sort of thing. But then someone still needs to sort of organize, and the CDOs that we talk to, they like the idea that there's this group, that actually coordinates across, everyone else, because that helps to move the process along and make sure that it, the ship stays steady, if you know what I mean. So
Yeah. Final question for you, Fern, and it's relatively a large question, I think. It's on the topic of culture because it does seem to be a hot button topic right now. So how do you build the culture to succeed in modern analytics, regardless of which model you might be in?
yeah, regardless of that or of the organizational model, yeah, that's a big question. So I think that executive support is really important. The leadership is really important. Even in what I was talking about before, what we see is that if the CDO is in the C-suite, then things get better. Those are companies that are more likely to succeed with data and analytics because they have the visibility, someone's evangelizing, they have the ear of, the CEO, et cetera. So it's really important. Executive leadership is really important. And, these executives need to communicate the why and the how of the strategy. So if you have a chief data officer, they need to communicate. What we see is that a lot of organizations, they don't move forward maturing because there's no communication, and even if you have this office and the CDO, if they're not communicating what the strategy is, then, that or how to use the data, and there's going to be a problem, so they need to walk the walk and talk the talk, and, really communicating the value of data and analytics, leading by example, and getting the whole organization into the data speak, and it's not just really the executives that have to communicate. Of course, everyone should be communicating with data. And what we see is that in some organizations, they're building out processes where they'll publicize, new strategies, they'll publicize new roles and structures. They have newsletters that they're talking about what's happening with data and analytics. They're holding lunch and learns, they have these company-wide meetings. In some cases, we've seen organizations be successful in terms of culture, in terms of using formal change management processes. There's processes like the McKinsey 7S's. I don't remember exactly what each S stands for, but, and other processes like that. And some organizations have been really successful using that. At the end of the day, though, I think it's about getting people to use data to make decisions, and so that's going to involve this culture of, really speaking with data, implementing the literacy teams. It's all of these things coming together, and it's not something that happens overnight, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's interesting because I don't know, I think the word culture really makes a lot of sense here, but it is hard for me to define that. I always assume that companies that work with, data and analytics should automatically have a culture of working within that realm and thinking forward and all those things. But the more I've learned, the less that seems like a reality.
Unfortunately, that's often the case.
Yeah.
And there's groups of people that are doing a lot of great stuff, but at the end of the day, people are still making gut decisions and, not trusting the data and that sort of thing. So that's why it's like a whole effort and is needed. And, frankly, that's why data governance is so important too, so that people will trust the data. Because if they don't trust it, they're not going to use it, and you're not going to have a culture that supports it.
That's very interesting. I do think we should probably have an entire episode dedicated to culture. I think that would be an interesting one. Maybe down the road sometime we can do that. Fern, I do want to let you go. I know you're very busy, but I did want to call out some of the research that you might be able to recommend for those that are listening that want to learn a little bit more about this topic.
Yeah, so we actually did a best practices report on this. It was late in 2022. If you go into the TDWI website under research and resources and look under best practices reports, you'll see a best practices report in hot pink that is on this. No, the cover is in hot pink. And so it's on modernizing the organization to support modern analytics. And you can look there. We have webinars we're doing on the topic, as well as the topic of culture. I think we did a webinar on that fairly recently also. Dave Stoddard did that.
Well, fantastic. Thank you so much, Fern, for your time. Go ahead, be sure to go and download that best practices report to learn a little bit more about this topic. But I will let you go, Fern. Thanks again for stopping by today and for talking with us.
My pleasure, anytime.